First, I should note, as we sit here in the summer of 2025, the summer of an odd year is usually in the past a quiet time for election officials. It's usually a time where there's not as much going on. There's an effort to train and recharge and maintain voter lists and plan for the next elections and doing all of the hard work that most voters never see in advance of an election. But what we're seeing right now is just an unprecedented flurry of activity, almost all of it originating from Washington, not from the states themselves, and being directed at the states, trying to dictate policy to how states and locals are running elections. So I'm going to talk about that today and what it all means. I'm going to talk about four different things. First, what has happened so far? Second, I want to ask a really important question, which can the federal government do this? Does it have the power to do this? Then we're going to talk about why the federal government might be doing these things. And finally, we're going to talk about what citizens can do to ensure that democracy continues to thrive in the United States. So let's start first with just what's happened in just, if it's hard to believe, only about 6 months since President Trump took office. In just those 6 months, and just with regard to elections policy, we've seen the Trump administration completely decimate the election cybersecurity capacity at the Department of Homeland Security, which had been built over many years, including over the first Trump administration, to really support election officials at the state and local level as they were trying to secure their systems against things like foreign interference and hacking. That capacity has been essentially demolished. Information sharing is essentially non-existent anymore, which is a sharp contrast to what was going on just 6 months ago, and also what was going on during the first Trump administration, which was absolutely crucial as we were seeing so much disinformation and efforts from foreign adversaries in the run-up to the 2020 election. We've seen the elections executive order, which was signed at the end of March, which sought to dictate policy to the states in terms of how they run mail voting, how they determine citizenship of voters. And it's important to note for those that aren't aware, we already have voter ID nationwide in the United States. This is often not discussed. Every single registered voter for over 2 decades now has to provide a driver's license number or a social security number in order to register to vote. And that number is checked against files that are held by the state DMVs or the Federal Social Security Administration to confirm eligibility to vote. If they don't have either, there's a very small number that then have to bring ID in order to vote the first time. So there's effective voter ID, but the elections executive order was seeking to impose an entirely new system of proof of citizenship, documentary proof of citizenship, that on the states that they had not passed. We've also seen another executive order that I know for those of us that worked in the election space was really troubling, specifically and individually targeting the former director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Chris Krebs, who was instrumental in overseeing cybersecurity protections for election systems during the Trump administration. This is someone who President Trump appointed in his first administration. This is someone who served under President Trump for almost the entirety of the Trump administration, and he was targeted by President Trump in this administration, claiming that he had committed crimes. It should be noted that there is absolutely no evidence he's committed any crimes, and there's been no evidence that there's an investigation or any upcoming prosecution of Chris Krebs, who, in my personal opinion, was a great public servant who served election officials remarkably well. We've had leaked threats coming from the DOJ and reported in the New York Times about the DOJ seeking criminal indictments of election officials. We haven't heard much after that. I expect we won't hear much after that. It's one thing to leak something to a newspaper. It's another thing to put something up on social media and make these bold claims. It is another thing entirely to go to a grand jury, present evidence, get an indictment, and then go to a court and present evidence sufficient to convict someone by a jury of their peers beyond a reasonable doubt. And I expect we will see absolutely none of that because there is no evidence, let alone sufficient evidence to convict. anywhere because election officials have performed admirably now in every single election over the past several election cycles. We've seen the DOJ attempt to interfere in an entirely state prosecution of an election official in Colorado, Tina Peters, who was convicted by a jury of her peers with substantial evidence of having sought to undermine the integrity and chain of custody of her election technology and allowed outsiders to gain access to that election technology in violation of state law. We've seen recent DOJ outreach just in the last few weeks to well over a dozen states seeking to compel them to hand over their entire voter list, including sensitive information that states are almost always prevented from sharing, such as driver's license numbers, social security numbers, and in many cases, dates of birth. And where federal courts have been very clear that information should not be shared by the states. I'm going to get to their justification for that in just a few minutes here. We've seen DOJ lawsuits in some places, including one in Orange County, that again seeks that sensitive information, seeks that driver's license, social security number, and date of birth information that is heavily protected in California and in virtually every state. We've seen Trump uh, encourage mid-decade redistricting in Republican states, perhaps most notably in Texas, where he's just said, get me 5 more districts, and has been assisted by a pretextual letter created by the Department of Justice that is very legally flawed and seeks to inject partisanship even further into the redistricting process in places like Texas. And of course, we've also seen, and this is not originating from Washington, a very predictable response from blue states that might retaliate. So we're getting into a tit for tat with regard to mid-decade redistrictings, and who knows where that will end. And then finally, all of this is kind of surrounded by continued rhetoric about stolen elections, about um, false claims about how our elections aren't secure, accusing public servants and even former presidents of treason and crimes. And again, never are these actually followed up with real investigations and the presentation of evidence to courts. They are just made on social media and elsewhere without any follow-up whatsoever. So that's just a partial list, to be perfectly honest. It is a very volatile time for particularly the public servants who run elections in this country. From my perspective, I speak to them all the time. I speak at their conferences. I travel across the country and I work with election officials. I can tell you it doesn't matter whether they are liberal Democratic Harris voters or conservative Republican Trump voters. Election officials almost 100% feel a deep calling to give us all our voice, and they work tirelessly to do that. And yet, right now, because of all these efforts, I feel like they're almost surfing on quicksand, where they are not sure what will happen next and whether or not what is coming out of the White House is something that can actually be forced into policy upon the states and local election officials, and of course, how that's going to affect their voters. So, the very first question we need to ask with anything, particularly with this administration, is does the president, does the executive branch have the power to do this? It is easy to sign a piece of paper. Any of us can sign a piece of paper. But if we don't have the power to do something, then that piece of paper is only worth what that piece of paper itself is worth. And the founders thought about this. The founders were really genius in how they conceived of a balance of power and how important that was to our system of government, and how even 250 years ago they were thinking about things that are still relevant to us today. And they enshrined limits upon the executive in the Constitution. Remember, they were coming out of a revolutionary war against a king, and one of the most dangerous things from their perspective was an excess of executive power that could not be checked by other branches of government in some ways. And so the Constitution very clearly delineates limits on executive power. Things like spending are not in the realm of the executive. That's in the realm of the legislature, the Congress, which is the Article 1 branch of Congress. Even things like tariffs, as you hear more about tariffs and litigation about tariffs, tariffs are in the domain of Congress, not in the domain of the executive. And this is especially so for elections. Elections was carved out in a way that was special. because the founders were very concerned that an executive could try to seize the mechanism by which that executive could gain power. And so they created something in the very first article of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 4. And Joni, you can put up the slide now of the Elections Clause. You can see the elections clause here. It's coming up here in just a second. I encourage you all to refer back to it and read it because I think it's really important, regardless of whether the president is Republican or Democrat, regardless of whether the Congress is held by Republicans or Democrats. This governs all the time in the wisdom of the founders. And what the elections clause states is the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. Now, think about that for a second. I think you can take that down now. And again, it's Article 1, Section 4, if anyone wants to look at it later. What that basically says is states are in charge of their own elections, including federal elections. They get to set policy. They can get to decide how much mail voting they have. They get to decide how much early voting they have. They get to decide where to put their polling places. They get to decide all of that. What they can't decide is when election day is. That's federally mandated, but they can decide pretty much everything else. And the only entity that can change that is Congress. Congress has done that occasionally. Congress has passed the Voting Rights Act, for instance, which was one of the largest impositions of federal government on state elections, desperately needed and passed in a bipartisan way, as most federal legislation around elections has been. The federal government the Congress rather, has also passed bills, like the National Voter Registration Act, the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, which helps military and overseas voters, the Help America Vote Act, which was passed on a bipartisan basis in the aftermath of the 2000 Florida election. But only Congress can do that. The president cannot do that with a swipe of a pen. And that's very important. This is something the founders very clearly and expressly thought of in advance. And so when you think of any policy that's being promoted by the president, think about that limitation and whether Congress has acted or not. An executive order has very limited power. An executive order can only instruct executive agencies how to enforce the law that already exists. So if there's already a law that exists and it's consistent with the law, the president can direct executive agencies to do certain things with regard to that law. But the president cannot create new law that Congress hasn't created or the states haven't created. And that's going to be a theme throughout this discussion. We should also note that the federal courts and the judiciary have stood up here as well and exercised their co-equal authority under the Constitution to evaluate what the Constitution says. And they have relied upon the elections clause in looking at the executive order in particular. Two federal courts have considered it, one in DC, one in Massachusetts, and both federal courts have enjoined almost the entire executive order as exceeding executive authority under the United States Constitution. We've also seen other pushback. Multiple states, both led by Democrats and Republicans, have refused to share sensitive data on voters. Republicans in states like New Hampshire have said no. Other Republicans in other states might share public data. The public voter files are widely available, things like name and address and whether or not you voted in past elections, which campaigns might use to do outreach. But the sensitive information, the driver's license numbers, social security numbers, and dates of birth, those have been withheld by election officials of both parties while they still are clearly complying with their obligations under federal law. So the short answer is the Trump administration can't do this, just like any other administration can't do this. And I think that's really important to remember. And courts have upheld that. And if you're someone on this call who might agree with what this president is doing, and there are some on this call that likely feel that way, or states that might cede power hoping that the executive will be happy and the president will be happy and they won't bother them anymore. We should all be aware that once this balance of power shifts between the branches of government, once power is ceded by the states, it's going to be gone forever. And the next administration will use that power. And that next administration very possibly might not be an administration you agree with. I think the best articulation of this point came from Senator Mitch McConnell, who wrote an op-ed in the in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago that pointed this out, that the executive just doesn't have this power. And if this power is ceded to the executive right now, because people might agree with this president or because people are scared of this president, that power will be very difficult to wrest back if an administration of the other party takes power. And there are multiple ways I can tell you, talking to Democrats, that they're already thinking along those lines. So the careful balance of power that the founders envisioned is important to preserve. So now, if it's likely they can't do most of this without Congress acting, I think a really important question I get all the time is, why is the president doing this? Why is this administration trying to pursue these policies? I suppose we could ask, do they understand that the president doesn't have these powers? I would suggest to you, yes, they do understand that. I think it's likely that they understand completely that the executive order, for instance, was likely to be enjoined, that the Department of Justice doesn't have the power or authority to force states to hand over vast amounts of sensitive data on their citizens, that the DOJ does not have the power to require states to violate their oath to protect that data, that they all take as state officials. I'll note that the administration hasn't appealed either of the two federal district court decisions that enjoined the executive order, which I think is somewhat evidence that they knew this was going to happen. And then I just ask, as a thought experiment, and it goes along with the point I made earlier. Imagine if President Biden had issued an executive order that aligned with Democratic Party priorities and allowed more people to be registered or allowed to cast a ballot, required more early voting, required more mail voting, did things along those lines. And imagine if a Biden Justice Department, led by Democratic appointees, enforced that with letters to states, largely red states, seeking to enforce those kinds of things. Imagine what the uproar would be from the Republican side. And what I'll say from my perspective, I think whether it's a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House, that balance of power between the executive branch, Congress, the judiciary, and the states is incredibly important to maintain. And I would suggest it would be appropriate to have raised an uproar if a Democratic president did that, just as it is appropriate now to raise an uproar and to be concerned when a Republican president is trying to do that. So if they realize that they don't have the power, I think one of the questions I have is is there an actual policy disagreement here? Is the administration, do they really want to do the things they're claiming? And I think it appears not really. Most of the claims that the administration is making right now fall apart under even the weakest scrutiny. It is simply a fact, and for those of you who've been involved in or heard me speak before, you'll know our elections are as secure and as accessible as ever before. Those who are alleging widespread fraud or even widespread voter suppression are simply not really looking at the facts as we have them right now. From the accessibility perspective, our registration is easier than it's ever been before in American history. More Americans have access to online voter registration, same-day registration, automatic voter registration than ever before, and not just in blue states. Online voter registration is in over 42 states right now. Automatic voter registration is in places like Georgia. It is easier to register to vote than ever before. And we're seeing that in turnout as well. For all the talks about accessibility, the last two presidential elections were the highest turnout presidential elections in American history. And the last midterm election in 2022 was one of the highest turnout midterm elections in American history. So Americans are finding it easier to participate than ever before, and that's a really good thing. And that's happening in both red states and blue states. Our voter lists are more accurate than ever before. States are doing a better job of keeping track of when people are moving so that they can add them to their lists if they moved them into their states and remove them from their lists consistent with federal law if they've moved away, or remove them from the list if they've died. And that's thanks to things like the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, which you can learn more about at ericstates.org, which is an independent entity run by the states who voluntarily choose to join. Half the states are in it. I take particular pride in it because I led the effort to create ERIC. And ERIC helps states share data so they can find out if people have moved between the states, so they can get a head start on cleaning up the voter lists and making sure, ideally, that every eligible voter in the United States has one accurate voter record in the right place at the right time, wherever they happen to be living at that particular moment. There's more access to mail and early voting than ever before for voters. 97% of all voters in the United States have access to early voting. We have 38 states that offer no excuse mail voting. Those are both all-time highs. That is remarkable, and we're seeing that in the turnout numbers. And then we also have to note that our elections are more secure than ever before. Since the computer age started over 100 years ago, we have more verifiable and auditable paper ballots in the United States than ever before. 98% of all voters in the United States vote on paper. So when you ever hear people talk about we should get paper ballots, we need paper ballots, the answer is we already have them. The only state without paper ballots is the state of Louisiana and a few counties in Texas. Outside of that, every single voter in the United States votes on paper. That paper is auditable, it is verifiable, it is recountable, and in fact, that paper is audited. The states audit that paper after the election to confirm that the machines counted the ballots accurately, and what we've seen in every single election is they have. Now, the machines still have to be checked. We can't just trust them. So we have to do certain things with the machines, and the states do this. The machines are not connected to the internet, and then they run the audits to confirm the results. We also know, for instance, and this has been a very big issue as of late, that non-citizens are not tainting our elections in any way. Non-citizens are not registered or voting in any significant numbers. We know this not just because I'm telling you this, not just because national studies have looked at this, but because even states that are allied with President Trump have looked at this and found non-citizen registration and voting to be extremely rare. And in fact, today, CEIR just released a report that NPR is reporting on, and I think it's going to be on All Things Considered here in the East in about 10 minutes, that confirms this, that looks state by state at all of the reports, even from places that were strongly allied with President Trump. In Ohio, during the campaign season in the summer, they claimed there were hundreds of potential non-citizens on the voter lists. After they looked at this data more and after the campaign was over, they only indicted fewer than 10. And that was over a period of about 10 to 12 years. Texas claimed thousands of non-citizens were infecting their lists, potential non-citizens on the list. But when push came to shove and they actually had to show evidence that justified investigations and prosecutions, they only submitted 33 names total of even possible non-citizens that might have voted in 2024. And I guarantee you that number is going to go down. We've seen that consistently, that even states that want to promote and amplify the number of non-citizens that are possibly registered in voting, when they're actually forced to prove their cases, to demonstrate the evidence, there is a drastic reduction in the numbers. The numbers are not zero, but they're very, very close to zero. And states are doing their best, given the pretty strong data that they have, both at the state and federal level, to ensure that non-citizens are not affecting our federal elections. I'll just also note that we are in a world where cyber attacks are only increasing. We're in a world where our foreign adversaries are only more incentivized to destabilize us, to divide us, to attack us through disinformation over the internet and social media and through cyber attacks. And we know that foreign adversaries, particularly Russia and China, as well as criminal actors, are ramping up efforts. And yet we've got to recognize that in the last 6 months, this administration has chosen to unilaterally disarm in that fight to keep our election infrastructure and other technology secure. Now, thanks to the paper ballots and the procedures in place, like audits that state and local election officials have, I'm 100% confident our elections are still secure. But it was a lot easier on them when, during the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, the federal government was partnering with them to help improve their cybersecurity infrastructure. And now that partnership is essentially over. So if the reason for this is not to change policy, if they don't really want the things that they claim to be seeking, I think the next question is, what's the real reason behind this? And I suspect that there are two main reasons. First, as I kind of alluded to, the administration is trying to fundamentally tip the balance of power away from Congress, away from the judiciary, and away from the states towards the presidency, towards the Oval Office, and in a way that was firmly rejected by the founders. But I think also what I'm seeing, and that I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on, because I think it might get worse over time, is by spreading these false claims about the security of our elections. I think the administration is preparing a flimsy justification to declare an election security emergency, and they might try to use that so-called emergency to try to invoke extraordinary and unconstitutional powers in advance of the next and future elections. And we've seen emergency declarations be used by this administration in other contexts. I mentioned tariffs. Tariffs are not in the province of the presidency. The only reason the president is seeking to claim power over tariffs is by virtue of an emergency declaration that he made. But without that emergency declaration, it is under the authority. All tariffs would have to be approved by Congress, and that's not happening right now. I'd also suggest that I think a lot of times we talk about this administration and executive power and are worried about the strength and power of the federal government and how strong these positions seem. But I'd argue that I think these positions are fundamentally weak and not strong. I think if the administration really believed that they had a mandate, if they really believe they can move public opinion and persuade Congress, they would attempt to move this agenda through the only constitutional means they have, which is Congress. So, for instance, with regard to non-citizen or documentary proof of citizenship with regard to voting, there's a bill pending in Congress right now called the SAVE Act. It passed by a very narrow margin in the House. It's currently sitting in the Senate. I think most people, including myself, think there's not much chance it moves through the Senate, but there is a congressional avenue that is being sought for that particular policy change. Whether you agree with it or not, that's the proper way to promote it. But clearly, the administration doesn't believe they have that kind of mandate, that kind of persuasive power in order to move it through Congress. And so I think that's somewhat an admission of weakness. And similarly, if they felt its position was strong and powerful and they were confident in the will of the voters, I don't think they'd be advocating for mid-decade redistricting. If you think you're going to persuade voters and you're going to be popular, you'd probably be seeking to get to that election as soon as you can and get what you think would be the windfall from that with the approval of the voters. But I suspect that the administration is worried about that. And so it somewhat acknowledges that it's a fundamentally weak position. But I do want to urge, this doesn't mean that those efforts aren't effective or even dangerous. Even if they come from a fundamental position of weakness, they create a significant number of problems. First of all, and perhaps most importantly for me, our election officials, again, those public servants who I've worked with for decades, people who often find themselves in elections by accident and find a calling and continue to serve their voters, who feel nothing but pride when they have high turnout and no problems, regardless of who wins the election, regardless of whether their candidate personally actually wins. But these election officials have been under siege since before 2020, and they continue to be under siege today, over 5 years later. Just in June, there was a firebombing of an election office in Colorado. a firebombing in the United States of America of an election office. I mean, 10 years ago, most election officials would have to work overtime just to get people to understand who they are and what they did. Secretary of State's jobs were not sexy jobs that people sought as because they thought it was a stepping stone. It was uh, often the work of elections. It's for as much as I love it and I love the people who are doing it, it's glorified counting. And it is remarkable that people get so worked up about it, that people have been so incited that they're willing to violently attack election officials, public servants, government workers, their neighbors in their place of work. I know of many election officials who get accosted when they're out in public shopping, when they're with their families. I know of election officials who've gone to their places of worship and are accosted by people even within their churches. And this is still going on, and it's continuing to be amplified by now the power of the federal government and the White House. And then when you hear these lies that tell you not to trust our elections, not to trust your fellow Americans, I just ask you to think how easily those could have been written and conceived in Moscow or Beijing as much as in the Oval Office, and how shameful that is. We are being prepped to just actually we have been prepped very successfully to distrust any election where our candidate loses. And if people want to think that this is only on one side of the political spectrum, they'd be wrong. This is happening on both sides of the political spectrum. It is not equal. It is primarily coming from the extreme right now, but it is coming from the extreme left as well. The extreme left has made claims before that were used by President Trump in his effort to undermine the results of the 2020 election. Even in the last few months, there are extreme left-wing activists who have been claiming that there is an election in New York that proves that the 2024 election was stolen. These claims are false. I'm not going to go into them a lot. They are fundraising off it. They're seeking to get prominence and get media attention on themselves about it. But the fact is that in New York, in all of the swing states, in every state except Louisiana, we had paper ballots that confirmed the result. And we know who won the 2024 election. President Trump won the 2024 election. Absolutely, no question, verified. We also know who won the 2020 election. President Biden won the 2020 election, absolute, confirmed. That election was probably the most scrutinized election in world history, both by courts and others. And as we sit here today, over 4.5 years after that election, there has still not been a shred of evidence presented to any court, as opposed to on social media, that would call into question the outcome of the 2020 election. And in fact, when grifters who lied about the 2020 election were sued in court for defamation, when Fox News was sued, when Rudy Giuliani was sued, when Kari Lake was sued, when Mike Lindell was sued for defamation, not one of them put on any evidence that their claim was true. And in a defamation case, for those lawyers who happen to be on the webinar right now, in a defamation case, you should know that truth is an absolute defense to a defamation case. And yet, Fox News settled before they went to court. Kari Lake and Rudy Giuliani conceded liability and went right to the damages phase. And Mike Lindell put on no defense. He would get out on the courthouse steps and spread false claims about the 2020 election. But when he got inside the courthouse and was forced to go under oath, he said none of that. And so we're seeing that those kinds of claims still exist, but again, you might hear them from both sides of the aisle, hopefully not in equal amounts and hopefully in declining amounts, but that's the way it is. I just can't stress enough how dangerous and ridiculous it is to lose faith in our institutions and public servants of both parties and to believe lies about our elections just because our candidates might have lost in a country that's 50-50 or in states that are 50-50. I mean, in 2024, a Republican presidential candidate and a Democratic Senate candidate won in both states like Arizona and Wisconsin. because voters are complex and they vote on different things. In North Carolina, a Democratic gubernatorial candidate won when President Trump won in that state. We see those kinds of outcomes all the time. We live in an incredibly closely divided country. And so none of us should be surprised when that happens. And it should not shake our faith in our institutions and in our neighbors and friends, the parents of the kids our kids go to school with who work in elections, because they are doing a remarkable job. But given that they're stressing this right now, I've got to say, the sobering thought that after all I've seen from this administration in the last 6 months, it's possible, though not inevitable, that we could see the administration seek to utilize the vast power of the federal government to undermine or actually interfere with the 2026 elections. And I should note, for those of you that might not be aware, we have literally never postponed or canceled a federal election in the history of the United States. We didn't postpone or cancel federal elections during the Civil War. We didn't do it during either World War. We didn't do it during COVID. We have never done it. Every single time this nation's election officials have been up to the task to run an election, even when they were faced with those kinds of challenges. And those elections have proved secure and withstood scrutiny every single time. So now to the key point, I guess, is what can we do about all of this while it's going on? Well, I've got several recommendations. First, get active in your local elections. Obviously, vote. Vote as much as you can. I suspect that the group of people on this call, we're probably voting in every single election. Special election for dog catcher, I'm there. I'll figure it out, who I want to vote for. But get your family and your friends and your neighbors to do the same. And then, really importantly, volunteer to be a poll worker if you have the time, and encourage others to do it. My high schooler has already served twice, even before voting. It's incredibly rewarding. It's a great public service. And most importantly, if you are someone who has doubts, or you know someone who has doubts about our elections, one of the great antidotes is to volunteer to be a poll worker, because you can then see all the checks and balances, the redundancies that exist that prevent fraud. And in the rare case it might be attempted, detect it immediately. And you'll know why our elections are so secure if you get to be a part of them and work for the election officials in your county or local election office. Second, if you're a lawyer, and Joni, maybe you can call up the EOLDN slide now. If you're a lawyer, volunteer for our Election Official Legal Defense Network. I talked about how election officials have been under constant threat, and many times that threat is directed at them legally. They're being threatened sometimes by some of the very government authorities that are charged with protecting them, their county boards, their county council, their county sheriffs. In 2021, two great election lawyers, one Republican and one Democrat, came to me and joined with CEIR to form the Election Official Legal Defense Network. Bob Bauer, former counsel to President Obama and White House counsel to President Obama, and Ben Ginsberg, former counsel to George W. Bush and Mitt Romney, came together and co-chaired the Election Official Legal Defense Network. It is a network of lawyers who volunteered to serve pro bono, to advise and assist election officials who might be in need so they never have to go out of pocket. As I said, it's been around for nearly 4 years now. We've helped dozens and dozens of election officials in over 20 states find a lawyer who will represent them at no cost to themselves. And if you're a lawyer, I can think of few other services as valuable as volunteering to be part of our network. If you go to eoldn.org, you'll find two buttons on the page where, if you're a lawyer, you can volunteer and get into our network. You might never be called. You might be called, but that's really important. And if you're an election official, there's also a button to submit a confidential request for assistance. We make a commitment. We get back to you almost right away, usually within less than 24 hours, and usually have a lawyer matched with you in a matter of days that will assist you in any way. I'm incredibly proud that my nonprofit provides this service to election officials, Republican and Democrat, from Alaska to Florida, from California to Maine. I'm very proud of this. I wish that it wasn't necessary for a nonprofit like mine to provide a service like this. But unfortunately, the need for this service has only ramped up in recent months, and EOLDN will always be there. If you're an election official who needs help, you will always be able to find legal assistance through the Election Official Legal Defense Network. That's our commitment to you. And if you're a lawyer, please help us. We'd love to bring you into this project. Lastly, I think one of the messages I'd like to leave you with is we get inundated with partisan news and social media that's targeted at us more so than ever. There are grifters, foreign governments who thrive on dividing us and who actually profit from your outrage, who profit from your engagement with sites that make you angry. You all know the sites I'm talking about on both extremes of the spectrum. I've made a conscious decision, and I'm trying to encourage others to look to real journalists with real news, not journalists who have been accused of being partisan, but actually journalists with journalistic ethics, who will report the news regardless of where it leads them. They sometimes will tell you the hard truths. These hard truths might challenge your ingrained beliefs. It might make it difficult for you, but it's important because facts and truth still matter. Turn away from those who will tell you the sweet lies that you've always been right, that those who disagree with you are your enemies, and that the election that you lost, you didn't really lose. We see this on both sides. Again, it's not 50-50, but it's not 100-0. And so you might see this and disengage from those sites that you know are pushing your buttons to try to get you to feel outrage. I find myself even somewhat experiencing that, and I try to be cognizant of that and turn away from it, because at some point we're going to need to restore this country to its institutions and a constitutional balance of power. And that's not going to happen with just one party or one ideology in place. This country is not going to magically become all Democratic in some moment. It's not going to magically become all Republican in some moment. It will take us thriving in an America where we love our fellow citizens, where we respect our fellow citizens, even when and often because we disagree with them. So I mentioned the elections clause, and I want to end with um, a quote from Federalist 59. I don't want to get too down into the weeds of our old high school and college social studies and political science classes, but I found Federalist 59 to be really relevant here. It was written by Alexander Hamilton. It was not turned into a rap in the musical, but I think it's really important. It's the specific Federalist paper that deals with the elections clause. And it ends with this statement, and I encourage you to look it up. It ought never be forgotten that a firm union in this country under an efficient government will probably be an increasing object of jealousy to more than one nation of Europe, and that enterprises to subvert it will sometimes originate in the intrigues of foreign powers and will seldom fail to be patronized and abetted by some of them. Its preservation, therefore, ought in no case that can be avoided to be committed to the guardianship of any but those whose situation will uniformly beget an immediate interest in the faithful and vigilant performance of the trust. And what Hamilton means by that is the states, that the various states provide some dispersal of that power in case federal governments seek to corrupt one particular element of our nation's government. So with that, I'm going to move on to questions. I've not been looking at the Q&A. I want to start, and give me just one moment here as I call up some questions. There were some great questions about what happens if there are criminal charges against election officials. This one's easy. I just mentioned it. Please reach out to Election Official Legal Defense Network, EOLDN.org. Tell your colleagues if you're an election official about it. Spread the word as much as possible. If anyone is being harassed, there doesn't need to be an indictment for you to seek assistance. There doesn't need to be an arrest to seek assistance. There doesn't need to be a lawsuit. It can be anything that you need legal advice or support on. And so I encourage you sooner rather than later to submit a request, and we commit to finding you someone if it's within the realm of your official duties. And it doesn't matter what party you belong to. It doesn't matter what state you're in. Um, Another question that came in through the registration process is what's the status of a DOJ appointment of a special prosecutor to examine election fraud claims from 2020? This was something that was raised by the president and some of his supporters in the last few weeks. And I'll say we just don't know. But I also would say, with regard to official inquiries where evidence will be created and courts will review, bring it on. Bring it on. Don't do this through social media. Don't do this through press conference. Don't do this through tweets or posts on Truth Social. Bring your evidence to court and subject it to scrutiny and cross-examination. And that's what a special prosecutor in the DOJ is required to do. Now, whether they'll actually do it or not, we'll have to see. Because this DOJ seems to be putting a lot more stuff into the media and leaks than it is through actual prosecutions and lawsuits. And I'll just note for those who see a lot coming out of the DOJ, claiming people might have committed treason or claiming that there was some abuse of power by previous officials in a previous administration, or claiming that there was some crime committed by public servants in states where their candidate lost. Don't listen to what they say, listen to what they do. Because what the DOJ does when it has a case is it doesn't announce it to the public. It doesn't leak it to the actual accused perpetrator that they're looking at them so that perpetrator can destroy evidence or start preparing his defense. The Department of Justice investigates crimes, and when it has enough evidence, it indicts, arrests, and prosecutes. And if it doesn't do those three things, that is an admission they have nothing. So remember that as you hear for the next likely 3.5 years, the Department of Justice investigates crimes, and if it has evidence, it prosecutes. It does not just leak that they think they found crimes. Had a really good question here from an election official that they've been asked to sign a memorandum of understanding by the Department of Homeland Security in order to share data or gain access to what's called the SAVE database that the DHS runs, which is a database of those who have an alien ID, people who are in the system, people who might have visas or green cards, people who might be in the process of towards naturalization. There is nothing that the federal government can do to require you to sign an MOU. In fact, if they could compel you to do it, they wouldn't need to have the memorandum of understanding. Now, it might be that there's state law that governs. It might be that your state legislature has spoken on this issue. So state law governs, not federal law. Federal government cannot compel you to do that. There is no federal law that compels a state to check for non-citizens on the voter lists. There is no federal law that prohibits a state from using its resources to try to find non-citizens on the voter list. And if they've confirmed a non-citizen accidentally got on the list or something like that, removing them through appropriate means. So a state can do it, but they are not compelled under federal law. So that is governed entirely by state law. I'm just scanning through some of these others. Oh, someone asked a question, what is ERIC and why did states choose to opt out of it? So I'll just say briefly for those of you, some of you might be some of you might be aware that there was an extreme right-wing propaganda campaign against states participating in ERIC. All of the claims that were made in that were false. I won't go into all of them. And it was ironic because this propaganda campaign actually successfully bullied several Republican-led states to leave the best tool they had to find people moving and people who had double voted or died. Eric has a wonderful anti-fraud mechanism. And so it was really just succumbing to disinformation. But Eric is still alive and well. There are Republican states still in Eric, along with Democratic states. Half the states are in it. About half of the voter population in the United States is in it. New York has just agreed to join, and other states are likely to join soon. So those states are still thriving with the best tool available to keep their voter lists up to date. Um, All right, I'm going to go through. Oh, here's a good question. How does a driver's license validate citizenship? So this is a place where federal law, various federal laws and state law mesh together really, really well. Um, the Real ID Act required that when DMVs issue Real ID compliant driver's license or state ID cards, they have to prove proof of legal presence. Everyone, if you know, if you've been to the DMV recently, there's usually two columns of documentation you need to bring. It's a proof of legal presence and proof of residence. And the proof of legal presence for the vast majority of us is going to be a US birth certificate or a passport, which also proves citizenship. And so what states like Georgia in particular have found, and other states have done the same, is if their DMVs are doing a good job with this, when they get the driver's license number on the voter registration application, they are checking it against the DMV file. And the DMV file clearly says this person showed us proof of American citizenship at the time they were in here. And in many states, Georgia, again, is a great example of this. They actually append the document itself to that file. So you can look at at the the proof of citizenship yourself. So so DMV data is incredibly useful now to doing that. It doesn't get 100% of folks, but it's the DMV data is very, very helpful. And every single voter in the United States who registers to vote has to swear under penalty of perjury that they are a citizen of the United States. If a non-citizen registers to vote, and we have seen it, as I mentioned, it usually happens accidentally because a state agency might have checked the wrong box, or because a third party group might have not taken as much care with their forms as others have. But understand that a non-citizen who registers to vote is almost certainly going to be caught, and they will have then painted a great big target on themselves. And that target is going to be a big problem for them, not just because it is a crime to vote under federal law if you're a non-citizen, but a lot of these non-citizens are here working towards citizenship. And having committed that crime, they're very likely to be deported. It is a crime with very little reward, the right to cast a one ballot in an election in which 160 million ballots are going to be cast, and a very big risk, which is that you might find yourself back in your home country because you've been deported. So it's one of the reasons we don't see that, but the DMV data is incredibly useful in that regard. Um, okay, I've got another question here as we're close to wrapping up. I've read something that Musk satellites could hack machines without directly connecting to the internet. How would you counter that potential rumor? Um, Musk satellites, by the way, we've heard Musk satellites did this in 2024. We heard an Italian satellite and dead Venezuelan dictators and a German server did it in 2020. It's remarkable how much the left and right extremes copy off of each other for a lot of these conspiracy theories. Um, I can't tell you that I'm an expert on Starlink and Musk satellites. I can't tell you I'm an expert on satellite technology, but these machines are literally just not connected to anything on the internet. So the satellites can't get to them through there. And most importantly, I'm pretty darn sure a satellite can't change a piece of paper on the ground in the United States of America. 98% of ballots are cast on paper. Every single ballot cast in the battleground states is cast on paper. In every one of those states and in almost every state, those ballots are audited, meaning they take samples of those paper ballots and they count them by hand and compare them to the computer count. So we know the results, and that's and we can be certain of that. So don't listen to folks on your side who might try to tell you that there was some kind of hijinks there. It simply can't be done, and that's because America uses best practices. Um, the I think we're running low on time. It's 4:58. So why don't we put up the last two slides? I'm sorry I didn't get into more questions, but we will be doing more of these. Please spread the word. Um, as Joni put in the chat, follow me on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. I'm very active there. I posted several things to Blue Sky just today. Go to electioninnovation.org, go to our website, sign up for our newsletter if you're not already on it. You'll get alerts about future webinars. If you're a lawyer, I can't stress again, go to eoldn.org and please volunteer to be a lawyer in our network. And if you're an election official, hopefully you already know this, but we have your backs. We're going to be there no matter what happens. And part of that means if you have a legal need, go to eoldn.org, and we're going to make sure that regardless of where you are, regardless of what party you belong to, if you're being harassed because of your work as an election professional, we're going to be there to assist and aid you in any way possible. Um, Hopefully, many of you on this webinar are going to be serving as poll workers next year. If you live in Virginia and New Jersey and other places that are having elections this year, I encourage you to do that as well. There's, election officials have a saying, if it's Tuesday, there's an election somewhere, which is usually the case. So find your local election official and volunteer and be a part of all this. With that, I just want to say thank you all for joining. Hopefully this was useful to you, all of you, and we'll be hopefully following up with you and have more of these in the future.